Hello everyone, how y'all doing? Now it's not often that I do back-to-back recorded videos, but after I saw that news about EA potentially looking into supporting Linux a bit more, I decided to kind of revive like an old topic that I've always had for a while, which is this insane idea that Linux unironically and not even intentionally might be the future of retro PC gaming. Now the thing is, hearing that at first glance sounds kind of weird, like why Linux in specific. And to be honest with you, I think in general, to explain why, it's first very important to understand what makes Windows, generally speaking, a very reliable platform for gaming in general. And a lot of that is because one of the biggest strengths that Microsoft has to this day is what I would consider to be one of their biggest strengths is mainly the fact that they're very good when it comes to general backwards compatibility. Like the reason for why, for example, with with video game consoles, like oftentimes whenever there's like a new generation of a console, there's usually never like a guarantee that like old gens are gonna work. Like I mean, with PlayStation as an example, like sure that maybe there was that level of like reliance up until the PlayStation 3, but then with the 4 they dropped full support for previous generations. On the 5, thankfully we were able to get backwards compatibility with PlayStation 4 games, and I guess to some degree they are porting some of their PS1 and 2 and maybe also PSP games to like their PlayStation store, but like at the end of the day, if you have an older PS2 disc, you still can't really put that on a PS5 and actually be able to play them. And that's a problem with even with Xbox, which arguably has the best environment for backwards compatibility. The backwards compatibility program doesn't work with every game, and so there's always that uncertainty with consoles. But with PC, there's always been like some level of reassurance that like no matter how old the game is, it's almost always guaranteed that it's gonna work on your computer. And a lot of that, I gotta give credit to Microsoft, is that in general they've always been very good when it comes to that stuff. And honestly, a lot of that I do feel like is part of their philosophy, is that in general they've always designed their operating system in a way where they try their best to not update it in ways where it'll break compatibility with certain things. For example, one of the most iconic things about Windows is the fact that they named their drives, the main partition for their drives as like C. And as far as I'm aware, the reason why it's named C is because in the past, the partitions A and B were reserved for floppy disks, and C would be reserved for the hard drive. Now, of course, nowadays floppy disks are not really a thing, and yet even to this day, C is still the main partition for Windows. And so it's one of those things where it's like they've always been this way. And I do still believe that in general they do still want to strive to like be this level of like consistent when it comes to keeping compatibility with older programs and libraries. But at the end of the day, it's not like this is permanent. Like no matter how you want to see it, over time there are going to be some libraries, some system calls that are just gonna eventually become deprecated, and they're gonna lose compatibility with it. Now, I do still think that in general, Windows is probably gonna handle that a lot better than Linux does. Like with Linux, like especially like this monstrosity of an OS, Arch Linux, when it comes to updates, they do not hesitate at all to jump to the next update, and even if it ends up breaking older programs, they do not care. Funny thing is, I'm using NeoFetch to like show this off. Funny thing about NeoFetch is that it's actually not available on the official repos anymore, and so I assume that NeoFetch is still going to work because it's a very lightweight program that doesn't really require a lot of dependencies, or at least not a lot of critical dependencies that, at least as of right now, could cause something to break. Like for example, if I type pacman -qy NeoFetch, just overall, um, yeah, it doesn't like a lot of the packages that it would depend on and require to run this are not anything super critical that I think this is gonna suddenly stop working. But it doesn't mean that it can't happen. And if it does happen, there's fast fetch obviously, and I probably should install fast fetch at some point because NeoFetch, it for a while they've essentially dropped support for it, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, I mean, obviously this is a pretty banal example, but it is something that has always kind of held back native Linux gaming. Is that yeah, at some point, who knows if some game will suddenly stop working after like an update? It can happen. There are some solutions, like I believe Steam has their like some sort of like Steam runtime thing where it kind of allows them to have like it allows them to maintain a lot of the critical dependencies sort of locked in spite of in spite of what operating system you're running and everything like that, which is something it's kind of cool. It's probably the closest to sort of like a how do I put this? It's I guess it's the closest thing to a Proton that we have for Linux, when it comes to keeping compatibility with games regardless of what operating system you're at, regardless of what update you're at. But even then, like I still don't think the Linux has the same level of like backwards compatibility maintenance that Windows has. But despite that, well, I do think that's a cool thing about Windows. Keeping backwards compatibility for older libraries is not always a advisable thing to do, especially if you don't want to make your operating system super bloated. And it is something that Windows has been criticized a few times. People do criticize Windows for being very bloated, and part of it is because they do tend to still want to stick compatibility to like older libraries that no one probably even uses anymore. I don't think it's the only reason, but like it is one of the things that would contribute to that. And the thing is, with Linux, the reason why I like to like ponder this idea that it might be the future of retro gaming is because a lot of games are not really designed to natively run on Linux, so obviously they do have to use compatibility layers. But with a lot of the compatibility layers is they like to create nested environments, like sort of sandbox environments where you have a certain wine or proton prefix. It'll have all of the DLLs, all of the file structures, file systems, all of the. It'll also come bundled with a lot of the libraries, like for example, I don't know if Mono is bundled, but everything that they certainly like, whether it's DXVK or VKD3D, everything that they really need to like allow this to run in, like essentially they do everything that they can to create an environment that can allow this game to work with all of its necessary dependencies. And what's really great about this is that these environments work regardless of which version of regardless of which Linux distribution we're in, regardless of which versions of all the packages you have on your computer are, because more often than not, these Proton prefixes, they don't really impact your actual main system because again, they're in a nested sandbox environment. And I think that's great because it's not something that you can say the same about Windows gaming. Is that Windows gaming, their games they do need to have some dependencies because it's running on the system natively. But on Linux, it doesn't really have that. And so the interesting thing about this is that in Linux's effort to increase compatibility with Windows gaming, I feel like they're also making just general preservation of older games potentially more reliable. I mean, as an example, we have things like VKD3D. VKD3D is mainly for DirectX 12 games. So if I open this page here, so there's VKD3D. There's also DXVK, which is for DirectX 11 games. Though recently, it seems like they're also expanding to older APIs. As you can see here, now DirectX 8. There was a time when 8 was not included in the list of DirectX APIs that they could run, but now it's going 8, 9, 10, and 11. And you know what's really cool about the likes of DXVK and and VKD3D. There's another one that's D7 VK, if I'm not mistaken. This one is interesting because this one runs even older APIs like 765. Like Direct 3D5, we're talking about shit that was for games that were from the fucking what? 90s, early 2000s. Like we're getting very fucking retro with the versions of DirectX. And what's really cool about all of these pieces of technology is that at the end of the day, the main goal is to translate these older graphic APIs into Vulkan. And Vulkan is a more modern graphics API that I think is able to better utilize they have the potential of allowing the games to run at better performances than if you were to run, for example, like even on Windows. Like if you were to run like these older APIs natively, sure, it can do that. The fact that it can do that is great, but you know, given the fact that these are very old APIs, you sometimes you will wonder like, are these really utilizing the GPUs that I'm currently running on? Are they really running it to the maximum extent they can? But with Vulkan, because it's a much more modern and still actively maintained API, I don't know. I feel like this tends to result in a lot of games arguably running better on Linux than they do on Windows. Now, of course, with, for example, the XVK, technically you can also run this on Windows, but I've actually done that before. But still, like, but these technologies, they come bundled with Proton inherently, and so that's one thing about Linux that I find to be very interesting. And the other thing about Windows running older APIs is that I'm not even entirely sure to what extent we can expect this to continue to happen. Now, I like to believe that they are going to continue to push to have the older DirectX versions to still work with modern Windows. But sometimes I'll think, for example, with the Intel Arc GPUs, where maybe even until this day, they really struggle to run, for example, DX9 games. And DirectX 9 is not even that old in the grand scheme of things, but I've heard that those GPUs, they just struggle to run games of those APIs. And like I'm thinking at the top of my head, Storm Revolution runs under DirectX 9, and so if I had an Intel Arc GPU, am I gonna struggle to run that? And what about, for example, Windows on ARM, like the laptops with the Snapdragon GPUs, like they have to run like an even more critical. Well, I don't know if critical is the right word. They're running into a more like the level of translation that they have to do is it's not just about compatibility layer. They're also just outright emulating x86 the architecture. And I have to imagine that like they're probably running into more compatibility problems even compared to Windows to Linux. And obviously if Linux also does start to if we also start seeing more laptops running on ARM on Linux, it's probably going to have the same struggles. And so obviously this isn't really about Windows versus Linux. This is more so about x86 versus ARM. But still, if this is what Microsoft wants to push, it does kind of make you wonder, like, are we going to see more of these situations happening? Are we going to see a slow and steady trajectory in which Windows may end up having to drop support for some of the older, like even more older libraries than they've already have, and how that can impact people's abilities to play older games? I do hope that it doesn't get to that point, but if it does always make me wonder, like, if we ever get to that point, then like, will Linux end up becoming the solution? Because like, I don't know how Intel Arc GPUs run on Linux. I've honestly, the last time I really checked how things worked, it was years ago. So my understanding of those GPUs on Linux is like very outdated. But I want to believe that if you have an Intel Arc GPU, you can probably run Vulkan. And so you're probably not going to run into the same compatibility problems. But again, I'm just assuming. I actually am not entirely sure, but that's what I assume. And now I did hear that like there are some like some solution on Windows to get DX9 games to run on Intel Arc CPUs using some kind of something similar where I think it might translate to DirectX 11. I'm not quite sure. So the community does have their own solutions, and I do give them props for that. But even with that said, even if they're able to do that, you still have to wonder like, if not Linux, sorry, if Windows continues to drop support for older libraries, I do believe that it may get to a point where in order to run retro games, it starts to become much more important to create nested sandbox environments where all of the dependencies necessary to run these games are going to be the ultimate solution to getting a lot of these older games to work. And I feel like when it comes to that department, Linux is making a lot of progress. And even as of right now, I've already heard that there's a lot of older games that people have reported run actually better on Linux. When, yeah, thinking of that makes me think maybe Linux could be the future of retro gaming. And like, even, I was pondering on whether or not I should mention this, but like, I do think it's kind of impossible to not bring this up if we're talking about game preservation. But you know, obviously, when it comes to, for lack of better terms, archiving older games, I do think that while it might have been easier on Windows for the longest time, I think that with tools such as Lutris and Heroic, and where is it? There's this one that I've heard about it very recently. It's Fogus. It allows you, pretty simple and intuitive ways of installing a lot of um, backups of games, for lack of better terms, in ways that allow you to play a lot of like older games, even if they're not being sold anymore. And so that's also something to consider, is that maybe at some point it might have been daunting, but I think recently that process is becoming a lot easier. And obviously modding games might still become a little bit of a problem. I will say though that if you are planning on modding games, you definitely do need Proton tricks. And the reason why you need Proton tricks is because Proton tricks, I feel like, gives you a pretty simple way of running, like for example, like some of the mod menus and well, I don't know if, no, not mod menus, sorry, mod managers. Mod menu is something else entirely. But a lot of the mod managers, I think if you have Proton tricks or One tricks, there, it allows those mods to apply whatever mods that you wanna uh, run on the games, by making sure that it's actually running on the correct prefix. And so, even on that department, I think modding games on Linux is also becoming a lot easier. And so, yeah, I think that's really all I wanted to share, is that I kind of like this idea that like, um, there may become a point in time when me, for example, as a Linux user, I might be having a less stressful time running older games compared to someone on Windows. I don't know if I would say it's gotten to that point as of right now. I have run older games in the past, and usually the most annoying thing that I have to deal with is typically with gamepad support, but a lot of that is not really exclusive to Linux. It's just those games are old. They're not really, they're a lot of them were not taking into account the fact that I have a fucking dual sense controller. So, obviously there can be some annoyances on that department. I've even noticed that some games that, for example, if you buy PC games from a disc. I recently did that with one of the Hitman games, and something I noticed is that I did put the disc on my computer. It did recognize the files there. I was able to install it just fine. But what I noticed is that when I removed the disc and I tried to run the game, it still let me do it even if I didn't have the disc installed. Now I don't know if that's because Hitman, the game in question that I have, it just gives you that freedom where it doesn't really require you to have the disc on at all times. I don't know if it was just the developers being generous at the time, or if it's because maybe on Linux, whatever requirement that they tend to run in order to check if the disk is there, it seems to not be very effective on Linux. Now, I don't know if that's the case. Maybe I might need to buy more PC games on disk in order for me to know if that's the case or not. I would actually be that would actually incentivize me. I'm not even joking. That is actually something that I would consider doing more often, just to see to like how often does my computer actually require me to put the disk on after installing it. That's actually an interesting experiment. I might look into that. But yeah, like even on that department, things are kind of interesting on Linux. But yeah, I think that's all I wanted to share. Like in general, obviously, Linux is not a better platform for gaming than Windows. There's still very blatant advantages to playing games on Windows compared to Linux, anti-cheat being one of them. But in the current direction that we're in, I don't know. Linux is pretty competitive PC gaming wise. But yeah, that's all I guess.